Hey guys, welcome back to another Tim Cain reaction. This one is on the cost of moddability. I've worked on, well, one game we can say with official modding support, that being Darkest Dungeon. And I don't think I learned as much. Well, I also started as a modder for that game, but I don't think I appreciated as much as I do now. Just the difficulty that it takes to making a game support mods even unofficially, let alone having official mod support, is a bit of a technical nightmare. And there's a lot of considerations that you have to have too for um, just like the way that the game will react to mods or mods with conflicts. You know, Darkest Dungeon is a good example of one that there are quite a few core files where if you have mods that conflict, it just won't work. As opposed to other games, especially with mod, controllers that might be able to adjust unique item IDs or whatever to enable mods to work more seamlessly together. So the next time you're playing like the big Bethesda RPG, just know that as problematic as the creation engine is, as many problems as you might have with it, and I have my own qualms with it, it is also one of the greatest modding sandboxes for game engines that has ever existed. And having them say, "Oh, I wish they switched to Unreal Engine." No, you don't. No, you don't. Not if you like your mods. Not if you like how easy it is to expand and build for it. So, modding is certainly something that has a pretty big overhead and will increase the budget of any game.
Hi, everyone. It's me, Tim.
Hi, Tim.
Today, I want to talk about the cost of moddability,
Yeah.
specifically the cost of making your video game moddable by end users. And this is a really good topic, and it came from a really good question by Pelicano 1987, who asked, "How much in time money does it cost to make a game moddable? Usually, players just think that releasing the dev tools is enough, but it isn't. When is it viable to think of allowing easy to mod?"
It isn't because that assumes that the developers have written all of their systems to be moddable, right? And you could have any amount of the code hard coded, or the inventory only checks for 5 different item types, and that's hard coded too, so you can't add new item types. I mean, there's so many little caveats. You can't just release dev tools, and in a lot of cases, dev tools is a fancy word for we have a proprietary game engine, or we have proprietary modding tools in itself, and they didn't just make your game as a one-off. So the cost is high, and it just isn't always feasible.
Even something like custom maps or sprites, 3D models, rules, and mechanics. How much does a game lose when it changes focus to allow for player generated content?
It's a good
I'm going to
question.
talk about this. I can't go into specific costs because it
It
varies. Are
just
you
depends on the
making
engine.
an RPG?
Yeah,
Are
and the
you making
genre
a
too.
platformer?
Hmm.
Is it just one indie solo dev? Is it an entire team?
Well, like how moddable is it too? Is it just changing the balance, changing like some difficulty numbers, or are you expecting people to implement entirely new maps? And then you also have to assume, even if you make a game moddable, and here's the really interesting one, right? Where again, we can go back and compare, for instance, Bethesda and I think Cyberpunk, because I remember that Starfield came out around the same time as Cyberpunk's DLC, and people were comparing the quality of the two. Uh, and I don't think they realized just how different it is to have like modded cutscenes and have a high production value for a game, and how that almost deters modders because their modded content likely will never even come close to the production value of the final product, that you have. And for as janky and simplistic as certain aspects of Bethesda games are, one of the things that makes it so enjoyable to mod is that that when you tell NPC A to move from location A to location B, it's going to look the same as when they have those sorts of, in-game, I won't say cutscenes, but cinematics or whatever, motions of NPCs that they have in the main game. So sometimes making a game of lower production value with modding tools will encourage more modders to jump into the game than having a high production value game with modding tools. It's kind of a juxtaposition there. People take modding games for granted and don't understand how hard it is to enable moddability at different levels. It can be moddable only for some models. Yes, absolutely. Yeah, very much so.
So I will talk about what goes into making moddability. But the reason this is such a good question is there are so many game players out there that think along this line. Why didn't they just make it moddable? All they had to do is, and then it's something like, duh. Let me just tell you that the answer
Yeah.
to this is the same as so many questions that come up in this channel: time and therefore money. You don't, it is not as easy to make it as moddable as you say. Whenever anyone says just do this, my immediate gut reaction is they have absolutely no idea what they're talking about.
Yeah, just turn on multiplayer. Just flip the you shipped the game with the multiplayer checkbox unchecked. I need you to reship the game with the multiplayer checkbox checked. Thank you. Thank you very much, developers. I will not change my negative review until you do so. I mean, I'm a bit of an extreme example, but you kind of get that feeling when you hear it, just add multiplayer, just add multiplayer, just add multiplayer, and then I have to sit there and I have to explain, okay, let me tell you exactly how these systems work behind the scenes and how there is absolutely no way this system can support multiple users without a complete refactoring of the not just this system, but the entire game from a foundational structural level would need to be completely rewritten just to enable you to see another character and engage with the same systems, even if you could never interact with that other player. Well, now you have to interact with the other players in some ways. And it's just like, it just keeps adding complexity, and again, money. All gamers say just do this, just make it multiplayer. No, vast majority of gamers are just that. Okay, here's the thing though. I don't think that gamers need to know any of the deeper problems that exist with just add multiplayer, just add mods. But it would be nice if they could understand that these things are in pretty much every case never just something simple that can be done. And a lot of games would need to be completely rewritten to support even multiplayer. And then to support modding, you need a complete framework to enable that or to allow for that. That is, yes, it's a little bit easy. I will say easier to do with custom engines, but by easier, I mean when you make your engine from scratch, you're designing those systems that you need in your game from the ground up. So you kind of have that in mind rather than refactoring an existing engine to enable that. So it's just be understanding that, you know, if I'm going to release a single player game, probably there will never be the ability to make it multiplayer supported. I would have had to build that and design that from the ground up. They don't need to, but at the same time, they will still be entitled. It will never change. I think they have a right to ask for it. Demanding it, of course, is, you know, a little bit of a different attitude. But when we say that that's just not going to be possible, I wish that there was more understanding of why. Like, here's why it would require a complete rewrite of our systems. Please don't say, well, then just rewrite all your systems, because it took us 2 to 3 years to write all the systems now. And here's how much money it costs. So if we get this many more sales, sure, we can do it. Ask us something, but the majority just straight up demand stuff. I get that they paid for it, but yeah, it's weird. It is weird. And I mean, they could say, okay, well, then why didn't you do it from the start? Well, to do it from the start, we would have had to have more, you know, engineers on board, more programmers on board to support multiplayer, which of course then also increases the amount needed for quality assurance, because we have to test things in single player and multiplayer. So, you know, the budget would have inflated by, let's say, you know, 30 to 50% to make this game multiplayer from the start, and we already had enough trouble getting the budget, you know, the funding that we needed to make the single player version of the game. So if anything, you know, I say, okay, well, we will look into it for a sequel if that's what people want. But, you know, in a lot of cases too, it could just be a vocal minority.
frequently this is, from a manager. Hey, Tim, why don't you just do this? Because that would just take this long, which would just cost you this much money. Do you still want me to
I
just
like the
do that?
passive
That kind of
aggressiveness
thing. And
to
they're
it.
like, no, I can't you just do this right now? And I'm like, nope. And then we talk about why it would take that long,
Exactly.
which I usually have a good reason for saying why something would take 2 weeks. It's not just me going, it takes 2 weeks because I don't feel like doing it. With
Yeah, it's usually it's like developers didn't not include didn't double negative. It's not like they failed to include multiplayer because they were just lazy. It's usually a conscious decision because the primary market of their game will even if it did support multiplayer, they probably would only play the game in single player. And to add multiplayer is like it's this much complexity for potentially not much of an increase in sales. A lot of people just don't understand that while it's nice to have multiplayer, there are certain games and certain genres that 99% of players will only ever play solo. That's just the reality of it, right? Just laughing my ass off thinking what it would take to try to make your game multiplayer a laugh that actually hides crying. I mean, it's the same thing too with Golden Chronicles. Like, it's like, okay, well, you have to make all these decisions. So what happens? Like, do people make decisions with NPCs themselves, or do they do it together? Why should multiplayer exist in this game? People just say just switch to Unreal. It's so easy to do multiplayer. It's so easy to replicate some things. Sure, that doesn't mean that it's easy to do multiplayer. Like they forget that you have to design systems to work with multiplayer and not just replicate seeing another character on screen. Like sure, yes, I can replicate seeing another character on screen, another person. That's not at all making the game actually playable in multiplayer. And they replicate the basic things out of the box, and that's it. Yeah, yeah. I mean, it does, and for it, I will say that if you're prototyping like a multiplayer game, prototyping in Unreal is really nice because you can replicate some of those simple things out of the box. But that doesn't mean that it's easy. You can just turn on replication of the character's pawn, and now the game magically has multiplayer.
which I've run into. So first I'm going to talk about what it takes to make a game moddable. And let me caveat this because I have caveats on everything now. It helps to do this from the very beginning.
Yes.
When you first start designing the game, preferably, but before you lay
Exactly.
down a single line of code.
Yes, it's done in pre-production. It's one of the same issues I had with the Stop Killing Games initiative, right? We had a whole talk with Ross about that too, which was really, really great. It's on our YouTube if you're interested. Is that, all of these things do need to be handled from the pre-production stages. If you're adding moddability, if you're adding multiplayer, these things dramatically change the way in which you design and engineer the game as a whole, which of course then also in most cases increases the budget of these games. So you do need to handle that in pre-production because that's when you create the budget, when you determine the scope, and you determine how many people you're going to need to hire during each milestone in order to get those milestones completed. So it is very, very, very rarely anything that a developer adds after the fact that the game has already been released in both moddability and multiplayer. And in the cases where it has been done, it's usually only done because the developer made enough money to be able to support that complete refactoring or those additions. That's it. And there might be one or two stray outliers, but I promise if you look into most of those occurrences, that you will find that to be the case.
You really want to have decided how the game is moddable and how you're going to make it moddable. Because retroactively converting a game to be moddable is really hard. And by hard, I mean time, and by
Yep.
time, I mean money.
Well, you're pretty much redeveloping the game. I mean, and you do save some time knowing what the game's end result needs to be, but that assumes it's almost assuming that the majority of time spent in a game is determining how it's going to look when it ends. When in reality, 99% of the work is actually just making the game. It's actually just implementing it and bug fixing it. And now that you have multiplayer, you're kind of undoing a lot of the QA and bug fixes that you've already done in the game, because now there's this completely new other chaotic factor, which is another human. And what happens during disconnects? What happens, when do you save things? Do you allow players to interact? How do players interact when there's another NPC? You have to change the AI of enemies now to have, to either prioritize one player or switch between them. It's it's just not feasible in a lot of cases. It really just doesn't know how it work. Unless MP Doug's give me PTSD. Besides designing the systems to support multiplayer, then you have to decide that what type of multiplayer do you want. Will it matter if people can cheat? How would you store the data? Will people connect to a server? Yeah, all of it. Like self-hosting, then it's like, well, what happens now? Now that you're connecting to your friend halfway around the world, how do you manage latency? It adds so many complicating factors on top of it that seem so simple sometimes if you don't know what is going on with game development. But if you know what you're talking about with game development, it's people will say, why don't you add multiplayer to Golden Chronicles? And I have to say, well, because the game that we're making is already enough of a challenge for the team that multiplayer would just add too many challenges. Like it would literally just be so many unknown unknowns, or in this case, known unknowns, that it would be a slog to develop, and likely we would develop it very poorly. And it would be better to make a separate multiplayer game and then bring that knowledge over to a sequel to Golden Chronicles once we know, okay, we know how to do multiplayer now. We also know how to make this systems-driven alchemy game. Let's make the multiplayer systems-driven alchemy game, right? If we have enough money and time to do it. So, I'm sorry, these topics really get me a bit fired up too. Because if you've ever released a game or you've worked in the industry professionally, you've heard it. You've heard it a million times. Just make the game moddable. Just add multiplayer. And some people will want to listen to you and hear you and understand why when you say it's not possible. They want to learn why it's not possible. But then you have a few other people, and this is very, very few, a minority, who they will say that you're lying, that you're finding excuses. It's kind of like the weirdos, right? Where it's just like, no, you're wrong. And it's like, I designed the game. I know the code base. I've seen it. I know what it takes. No, it would just press this thing. It's like, I'm going back to work. This game will not be the game that you want it to be. That's okay. Here are some alternatives and some competitors. Maybe you like these more. Just get AI to do it for you.
You'll be rewriting things that already work. You'll be rewriting code that already works flawlessly, just so they all go through a choke point, so that you can check for modifications. And I will talk about that.
And redo all your QA.
At the very highest level, there are 3 stages to making a game moddable. And they are making the systems exposable, and then exposing them, and then making the resulting exposed part changeable and preferably easy to change by a modder. Although that latter part is completely optional. As long as it's exposed and they can get at it, at some point your job is done. Anything you do to make it easy for them to modify it is you being nice and pleasant and hoping that you have a big modding community, which may not be the goal of your game. Keep in mind, every time you write a game, you have goals for it. And is one of your goals easy moddability? If it's not, if moddability isn't even a goal, why are you doing this?
Yeah, exactly. And, making it easily moddable, I think, is a slightly important note. If you make, he's right. If you make it, if you expose it, modders will find a way. But you also don't want to lock, for instance, the only way to make this, to export it to the right file format that can be read by the game is some $1,000 piece of software, right? Because, well, technically it's moddable, but, for most realistic people, it's not. So he's right. If modding is not your goal, why are you doing it? And if modding is your goal, then you need to determine exactly what that looks like and how easy it is to engage with it. One makes some money to buy food. Yeah, I mean, that is the goal number one, isn't it?
So let's talk about those 3 stages one at a time. So let's start with the first one, making systems exposable. You can do this in 2 ways. You can either have a method that uses data and you expose that data,
Mm-hmm.
or the method itself can be exposable. And I'll talk about that.
And it might be something as simple as like uh, you know, player damage multiplier, right? And it's a float value. So, you have like some text file or something that you can just change and be like, okay, I want players to do a bit more damage. Save, done. And because it reads from that text file, easy to mod, easy to adjust. And I have nothing else to say about that. I mean, I think that that's one of the easier ways to expose it, but not all engines can just read from a text file like that. And once you start getting into more complex structures of how certain files might look, doing something like this just isn't going to be viable. The Pepsi Twist, it is Pepsi Max with lemon flavor.
The former, where the method uses data, it means you have some kind of way of calculating something that uses parameters, the values, and those values are read in somewhere, and you could therefore ultimately down the line it could be moddable by the players. An example of this would be weight of items. You can make the weight of any item exposed. It's somewhere in a data file. So when items are being read in, part of their data is how much they weigh. This means if you, the player, are playing this game and go, I wish ammo was weightless, you could solve that by finding where that data is and just setting all the weights of ammo to 0. Contrast this with the second method, which is the entire method itself is exposed.
But you also have to consider too that maybe you do have that, and maybe he'll get to this too, but you do have that like ammo file where it lists, let's just say light ammo, heavy ammo, special ammo, whatever, and you have those three parameters, and then the weight in that ammo weights file. Well, now the unfortunate part is that file is not very moddable without patches, where if you wanted to have, okay, I've added a new gun, download my mod that adds a new gun with a new ammo type, but you've modded the weights of that ammo to be 0, but it's all the same file. So now you have to make a patch that not only adds that new line in, but sets the weight to 0. So reading just bare bones text files is good. It's a start, but then you have the issue where you'll have to have people making manual patches for a lot of things because of that inability to expand. Or what's the good word for it? But you guys know what I mean. Like it's not very expandable in terms of modding compatibility.
This is it could be function or method. I'll just pick one, and I'm just going to call it a method. You expose that. So in this case, there's an encumbrance calculation somewhere, and the player in a mod can override the calculation, the entire calculation, not just parameters, which means instead of making ammo items have a weight of 0, you just skip them when calculating encumbrance. The encumbrance method no longer looks at ammo.
Yeah, there could be like just a custom multiplier, right? So it does all the calculations first, parentheses, times that player multiplier, default of 1, but then you can just say, well, now everything is half as heavy. And the nice thing about that, if we use the previous example of ammo, doing like these weights or these custom multipliers off of the final calculation, is that now we have the mod that adds new ammo types. We don't need to touch the weight of ammos here. We can just adjust one final parameter, which is custom ammo weight multiplier 0, and that will affect all of them too. So there are some tricks that you can do up your sleeve to enable some compatibility like that.
They both do the same thing in that case, but the latter method of exposing the all the methods in the game is way more powerful because you can actually change on the fly. Let's say you wanted ammo to, certain kinds of ammo to weigh double, or you wanted it to only make ammo count if you're playing on hard mode. Really hard to do that with the data method.
Yeah.
Very easy to do that with the method. Okay, so that's stage one. You've decided to make your systems exposable. So stage two is exposing them. How do you actually expose them? If it's parameter data, it's pretty easy. They're in files that get read in. So now those files exist somewhere, and we're talking about stage three. How does the player actually get a hold of those? The method one is harder depending on your engine. And this is another reason I can't go into too much detail on this, because depending on what engine you're using, putting in overrides are very different. So let me.
Like for instance, Unreal doing that is really not if it is possible, it's really not often done. Custom engines or Unity are much better at reading from external files like that, so they can just expose everything. Like maybe the entirety of the game's content is exposed, right? Like with Darkest Dungeon, all of the monster files were exposed. That was just how the game existed, and so you could just modify everything like that. But of course, you couldn't add new functionality to the monsters because that was hard coded behind the executable. And of course, you can't redistribute the executable for legal reasons. But you could add new monsters and you could combine certain effects, but you couldn't add new effects. So there were some limitations there. And other engines might package all of that into their own file, and unless you have a way to extract and repackage them, modding those things in is not going to be very easy. And then again, if it's all packaged into a file and you don't have any way to combine mods that modify the same package, no compatibility there, right? Unless you make a manual patch.
Let me talk about what I did in Arcanum, and I will link that below if you want more details. In Arcanum, for any system, there were two places where I checked to see if there was a script override. When you were asking, can I do this thing? And then do this thing. So, for example, for items, can I pick it up? Pick it up. Can I wield it? Wield it. Can I take it off? Take it off. Can I drop it? Drop it. There are a ton of other ones too. There are, can the player be seen by this creature? They see them. Can they go into combat with the player? Start combat with the player. The reason you have these that way is a couple things. The override on the cans lets you override the game and say they can't. They can't pick this item up.
Mm-hmm.
Like let's say you make an item and you're like, orcs can't pick it up. Boom. That sword cannot be picked up at all by an orc. Let's say you want to say if an orc picks it up, they take damage. Then on the pickup, you override and say, so you let them pick it up, but when they pick it up, you're like, are you an orc? Take some damage. On the can see in combat, you may say something like, I want to make a ring of invisibility and no one can see through it. It's an artifact. It's artifact level invisibility. So even see invisible spells won't see it. You just put on the can see function, are they player wearing this ring? Can't be seen. And that will override everything in the game. You may also want an NPC to do something special when combat starts, like yell, everyone come to me, we're attacking. You can do that easily by on the combat start on that creature, you just have them say that thing. This made it very easy for people to do all kinds of things in the Arcanum method, but it was something we had to do when we made the engine.
It's a conscious choice. We had to make sure,
if you want all of those, can they do this? It means every way of picking up an item had to go through a single choke point in the code so we could check the script there. And then every way of picking it up had to go through another choke point so that if it overrode the pickup function, everybody used the override. Not super hard if you haven't written a line of code, potentially very difficult if you've written a lot of code. And that brings me to this third step, which is
Sounds so easy, Tim.
Now that you've exposed all that stuff, how do you make that exposed part changeable? If it's data and files, you have to make sure those files can be edited by the player, and then the edited files take priority over whatever's in your database file. Somehow this has to, because that data has to get connected back in and has to take precedence over what was there. Preferably, you also let the player bundle all these files. If they make a bunch of different files and they want to put it into a mod, you give them a way to bundle it into that mod. So when they want to deliver their mod, they're like, here is a file that you drop into your mod folder, and that will override all this other stuff. Now, hopefully, these use all the same tools that your developers used. Maybe they can, maybe they can't. I've used a number of tools at different companies that assume they're on the network of the company, the internal network, so they can do things like check files into Perforce,
Yep, yep.
check status of things, put bugs into Jira. So they're interconnected with a lot of other things. Maybe they can be made standalone, or maybe you make a different set of tools for home users. But again, that would take you time, and that costs money.
You also need to consider like debugging all these things too, right? Because you might have put in some, maybe when making the game, you assumed that, okay, the player can pick up everything that they see. So let's put in a debug that catches and throws out an error if we find that there's an item in the game that can't be picked up. But then of course you have somebody making a mod where they make an item that can't be picked up because that's part of their idea, that's part of their design. Well, now the game's going to throw an error for their mod that isn't relevant to their mod because that was part of their design. So it's not just that you have to enable it and you have to make it kind of easy to access or just accessible in general. You also have to make sure that you've built good enough debug tools that when there is an error, that if it throws it correctly and in a way that the modder will understand and be able to fix without, I think that's more difference between having good mod support and bad mod support is that sometimes you may just not get a reason. There was a good example with Darkest Dungeon, right, where there was a hard-coded limit to the number of text files, because they were custom JSON structures, right, for the game that could be loaded at once. At nowhere was this listed when modding, and because at one point my mod for the game was so large that I was the only person to have discovered this limit, but the game would just crash. There's no crash log in Darkest Dungeon. There's no error that gets thrown when you have a hard crash. The game would just crash at random moments, and it was driving me crazy. And I would start to like remove things until it worked, and then be like, okay, I removed this thing, maybe it worked. So I go back, I put all my files back in, and I remove just that one thing, and then it crashes again somewhere else. It's like, well, I deleted the thing before, and I don't understand. So it was just like, it would just crash random places until I sent it into Red Hook. And I was like, guys, I know you can't prioritize this, but please, help me understand what's going on here. Thankfully, the programmer was really awesome and was able to, load up my mod with debugging symbols. And he's like, oh, you're reaching an internal limit that we never thought would be reached. And I'm like, man, it would have been so great if we knew that this existed as modders. So, yeah, thankfully, what he did was he eventually he fixed this like in the interim by just doubling the limit, and then he eventually exposed this to modders to change themselves. But sometimes you just run into those problems where certain things were never expected by the developers that modders are doing, and according to the way that the game is modded, they aren't doing anything wrong, but there might be some of those things that are hard-coded that just, how do you rate moddability? And I think that a game, game A being moddable and game B being moddable can mean completely different things. Oh, you just have to hard-code this in from 5 to something else, or just remove the check. Yeah, and that's one of the reasons why I'm not too harsh on the creation engine, because as many problems as the creation engine has, it is also one of the most beautiful engines for modding. Like, along with, I would say, maybe Minecraft and Terraria to an extent. Bethesda games and the creation engine in general is just probably the best modding sandbox to ever exist.
One thing to bear in mind is once a player mods the game, they have to be able to test it, and that's a whole other thing. That depends on the engine.
I'm sorry, Tim, I just talked about it.
May crash, and you may not be able to do anything about that. It may be the whatever off the shelf.
I promise you, I have not pre-watched these videos, but it's really funny that he just mentioned that after I just talked about it.
engine you're using doesn't handle bad data well.
Yep.
It also may depend on tools. Like if they want to mod something that you're letting them override a C# script with another C# script, it may need to be compiled. So the end user may need to have a C# compiler. Maybe not. Maybe you can come up with a different way of doing it, or that may be a restriction of the engine you're using. You also want to think about the kind of error messages you want or even can produce for mods. Like I said, if there's an error,
I'm sorry, Tim, I shouldn't
some
have
of the
paused.
games we've had inserted into Jira and said, hey, this game just crashed, and here's the stack.
Mm-hmm.
You can't do that for a modder
Yep.
because they won't have all those internal networking
Or the debug
features
symbols.
available to them. So you may need to make different error messages for mods. Again, more time, more money. And just as a side note, I've worked on several games where an error message said something like this: illegal script code, see Dave. And we just knew what it meant.
See Dave.
Because
I love it.
you shouldn't ever be able to have a bad script opcode in there. So if you ever saw one, that's catastrophic. It does not know what to do with that. And so you should go see Dave, because probably something was wrong with the tool.
Dave!
Or somebody made a change to an enumeration in code and didn't keep it aligned with something else that they were supposed to. There were also a lot of cases where I've worked on a game where an artist could and did crash the game by checking in a bad model or a bad texture. Bulletproofing all of that takes a lot of time, which means a lot of money. It also slows the game down to always check. As you load in every piece of data, check that it's in certain parameters. So many of my games, after we went from our debug game to our release prototype, we turned all those checks off to gain speed.
Yeah, I mean, consider too, like when we're working in Unreal, right? We're saying, oh, we have 50 FPS in editor, and you know, I think that maybe some people come in and say, oh, you're not even getting 60 FPS in your game. Well, it's like, well, you have to consider the sheer amount of debugging tools and data that's running in the background of Play in Editor versus the built version of that without those things in it. And it's impressive. You know, there's a considerable amount of debugging tools in Unreal. It's pretty impressive. But yeah, you don't want to package those for the player because you want the game to be very performant. But at the same time, if you don't package some of those in, and the game is moddable, then the player might be missing some of those abilities to make more stable mods. I was running Profile in Unity, which kills FPS, but I want to see everything that's going down. Yeah, I get how that feels.
Usually loading speed, but sometimes running speed. Guess what? Are you going to leave those mod checks in, or are you going to make a special parameter? Like, you can run the game in mod test mode and those checks are re-enabled. Again, time, money, and you now have to explain this to modders. I assume you have someone who's writing some documentation so modders will know.
We also have to consider, too, that, you know, assumedly, the people working on these modding tools and making sure all these debugs work and checks and whatever are going to be your engine programmers. And adding in Moddability not only increases the number of engine programmers you're probably going to want to have, but it takes their time away from creating the systems that need to be created in the engine itself. So, like you said, it's something you resolve in pre-production. You decide in pre-production, and then you specifically budget to create, but it will take time. Assume you have someone writing documentation. Don't make me laugh. Yeah. Wild assumptions from Tim today.
To do. In addition,
why do you think you had that error code that said "See Dave"? That's because Dave is the documentation.
Adding something like a model occurred to me that models may need, like a certain model, like a creature model, may require certain animation states, certain labels that can be searched for by the game engine, certain data that has to be there or it just can't work. If you put a creature in, there has to be a way for it to walk around, or is it flying only, and is that labeled flying, and does your game know what flying is, and what kind of combat attacks does it have, and where's that data kept? Is it kept on the creature? Is it kept somewhere else? All this stuff has to be done. Textures usually have to be a certain size. That used to be they had to be a power of 2 or boom. Now they don't have to be, but potentially it's way less efficient if they're not. So all that is documentation that you might have internal that may not be appropriate to externalize. Some will be, some won't. The ones that aren't have to be rewritten. Time and money. Also, I've already mentioned moddability depends on your engine. Unity, Unreal, and all the others, they handle modding differently.
Oh yeah, they do.
Some allow you to handle it differently yourself, even on the same engine. So you have decisions to make. Decisions means time. Time means money. For a game with a fixed time and budget, adding moddability then means you won't be adding other features. I talk about this in my video for design fallbacks. If you want to put in something, you may have to not put in something else just because you don't have the time to do both. And your time is fixed and your budget is fixed. So you have to think about that. In fact, for all of this, I just want to say think about it carefully. Adding moddability is not a no brainer. And anybody who claims otherwise is either inexperienced or trying to talk you into doing something that they want. I don't want to say they're lying, but they're basically trying to convince you of something that isn't true. So just remember, if you want to add moddability, you need those 3 stages. You need to make systems exposable, expose them, and then make the resulting exposed data something that modders can change. So I hope this answered your question, Pelicano 1987.
Another fantastic video from our man Tim. Here is the link for you guys to support him yourself. Yeah, it's something that I really enjoy. You know, I got my start in game development by modding, and something that I'd love to include in my own games. But I also need to consider just that, like it is here. Like there is a cost to it, and it is a bit of a big challenge to make sure that data can work that way. And we're working in Unreal, which is not the most mod friendly engine out there, you know, and if you want to make it mod friendly, there is a significant amount of work to be done there. So definitely our first game is not going to be very mod friendly, but I'd love if we could work on a game eventually that does have some sort of mod support with it. So for watching on YouTube, thank you for watching that one, and I will catch you on the next one. And if you're watching on the day that it's released, you'll see my new Colton Chronicles development stream up tomorrow, because we're going to keep working on that next week. So thanks for watching YouTube, and I will catch you later. YouTube, bye bye.